There comes a moment in life, usually after what people like to call a spiritual awakening, when something very peculiar happens. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet anything else. The old desires have loosened their grip. The old ambitions no longer pull at you with the same force. The old fears don't quite convince you anymore. And yet, freedom has not arrived. Peace has not settled in. Instead, you find yourself suspended in a strange psychological no man's land. You don't feel lost in the way you once did, but you don't feel found either. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes this phase so unsettling. Alan Watts often spoke about how the greatest confusion arises not when we are asleep in our conditioning, but when we are halfway awake. When the dream has begun to dissolve, but the dreamer hasn't yet disappeared. In this in-between state, the mind doesn't know what to do with itself. The old rules no longer apply, but new ones haven't been written. And so you drift. You function. You go through the motions of life, but with a strange sense of detachment, as if you are watching yourself from a slight distance. Things matter less, yet nothing feels fully alive. According to Alan Watts, this is because the ego has been wounded, but not yet surrendered. It's like a structure that is cracked but hasn't collapsed. You can see through it now. You can see how much of your life was driven by fear, by comparison, by the need to become someone. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. But seeing through the illusion doesn't automatically dissolve it. The habits of identity linger. The body and nervous system are still conditioned to respond as if the old self were real. So there's a kind of internal friction. Part of you knows the game is false. Another part is still trying to play it. This is why people in this phase often say they feel strangely empty, yet heavy at the same time. Not depressed in the usual sense, but not inspired either. Alan Watts would say that you are standing at the edge of the known world. The past no longer gives you comfort, and the future no longer excites you. You are no longer lost in the maze, but you haven't stepped out of it. And the mind, which thrives on movement and direction, finds this unbearable. It wants to go forward or backward, to become something or return to something familiar. But this space allows neither. And so the question arises quietly, sometimes painfully. If I'm not who I was, then who am I now? This question is not meant to be answered yet. The difficulty with this in-between state is that the mind treats it as a problem to be solved. It assumes there must be something wrong, some mistake that has been made. After all, we are trained to believe that every phase of life should have a clear direction, a clear identity, a clear purpose. Alan Watts often pointed out that Western culture is deeply uncomfortable with states of suspension. We admire progress, movement, achievement. We distrust stillness, uncertainty, and waiting. And so when you find yourself in this strange middle ground, the mind immediately tries to label it as failure, stagnation, or even illness. But according to Alan Watts, this state is not a malfunction. It is a natural consequence of seeing through the illusion of becoming. You have glimpsed, perhaps only briefly, that the self you were trying to improve, protect, and complete was never quite solid to begin with. And once this realization enters your awareness, the old motivations lose their authority. You can still pursue goals, still make plans, still engage with the world, but something essential has shifted. You no longer believe that fulfillment is waiting at the end of the road. And this is deeply unsettling for a mind that has been conditioned to live entirely in pursuit. So you float. You move, but without urgency. You think, but without conviction. You desire, but without hunger. And this can feel like a kind of limbo. Alan Watts described this as the moment when the caterpillar has dissolved, but the butterfly has not yet formed. The old structure is gone, but the new form is not ready. And if the caterpillar could think during this stage, it would likely believe something had gone terribly wrong. It would feel shapeless, useless, unfinished. What makes this phase even more difficult is that there is no social language for it. Society understands success and failure. It understands ambition and collapse, but it does not understand this quiet undoing. So you may feel isolated, not because others have abandoned you, but because there is no shared framework for what you are experiencing. You might try to explain it, only to find that words fall flat. You are not depressed in the way people expect, but you are not happy either. You are not searching in the old way, but you are not resting in peace. Alan Watts would say that this discomfort arises because the ego is still trying to survive the awakening. It wants to turn awakening into an achievement, a new identity, a higher version of itself, but this in-between state refuses to cooperate. It strips away ambition without replacing it. It removes meaning without offering a new story. And so the ego feels exposed, unnecessary, slowly fading. And this is precisely why this phase feels so vulnerable. There is nothing to cling to, no belief to hide behind, no role to perform convincingly. You are being asked, not consciously, but existentially, to exist without leaning on a narrative. To be here without knowing who you are supposed to be. This is not freedom yet, but it is closer than you think. In this in-between space, the world itself begins to look unfamiliar. Ordinary activities, talking with friends, working, performing daily routines, feel strangely disconnected. You participate, yet it's as if you are observing someone else doing it. Alan Watts often illustrated this by comparing life to a play. The difference is that the awakened person suddenly sees both the stage and the audience, the actors and the script, and realizes the performance is both necessary and meaningless at the same time. The mind struggles with this duality because it wants either full immersion or complete detachment. But in this liminal state, you are experiencing both simultaneously. Many people try to escape this awkwardness. They seek distractions, immersion in projects, relationships, or sensory pleasure, hoping to reignite the old sense of purpose or excitement. But Alan Watts cautioned that these efforts often backfire. The old mechanisms for creating meaning no longer satisfy, and forcing them only highlights the absence. You cannot manufacture motivation or joy in this phase, because the conditions that once produced them, identification, striving, desire, have dissolved. What remains is raw awareness, unstructured, unadorned, and frighteningly neutral. At times, you may feel impatient, even anxious, because this is a state with no clear map. The ego's habitual insistence on direction clashes with the freedom that has begun to reveal itself. Watts would say that this is the critical moment. The transition requires patience, observation, and surrender. It is not a phase to conquer or fix, but a space to inhabit. You are learning, perhaps for the first time, to exist without the scaffolding of certainty, without the props of ambition, without the illusion of who you are supposed to be. Interestingly, this in-between state can also bring subtle awakenings if approached wisely. You notice nuances in your emotions and thoughts that were previously overlooked. Small joys, sunlight on a wall, the rhythm of your breath, a passing smile begin to appear, but they are not attached to expectation. Alan Watts emphasized that awareness without grasping is the beginning of genuine freedom. You are neither striving for happiness nor fleeing discomfort. You are simply present, observing the movement of life without needing to control it. And yet, the tension is real. You feel the pull of old identities, old ambitions, and old fears. They're still echoing in the body and mind. Watts likened this to a room after a storm. The furniture is rearranged, some pieces are broken. The air smells different, but life continues within it. You must navigate this altered landscape, honoring the past without clinging, accepting the present without demanding, and allowing the future to unfold without expectation. This is why the in-between state is so paradoxical. It is unsettling, empty, and yet full of subtle richness. You are learning to see reality without the filters that once made life a series of contrasts, goals, and approvals. The old scripts no longer work, and that is precisely the space where transformation occurs. One of the most disorienting aspects of this in-between state is the sense of timelessness. Days stretch and compress in ways that feel unfamiliar. Activities that once defined the rhythm of life, work, socializing, achievement, no longer impose the same structure. Alan Watts often remarked that the ego relies on time and goals to anchor itself. Without these anchors, the mind feels adrift, uncertain of where to place its attention. You are living in a liminal moment where the past is gone and the future is not yet formed. It is neither loss nor freedom. It is simply suspension, a quiet, tense, and luminous pause between two worlds. This pause can provoke fear. Humans are conditioned to identify themselves through accomplishment, roles, and relationships. When these stabilizers no longer hold meaning, it can feel as if you are being asked to exist naked, without any protective layers. The usual supports, success, recognition, even social approval have lost their power to define you. Watts would suggest that this discomfort is a necessary part of the process. It signals that the old self is dissolving, making space for something unformed but authentic. The question is whether you are willing to inhabit this emptiness without rushing to fill it. Interestingly, in this space, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Small mundane details begin to carry weight in a way they never did before. The sunlight filtering through leaves, the sound of your own breathing, the rhythm of a passing day. These moments reveal themselves as subtle teachers. Watts often emphasized that awakening does not thrust us into dramatic peaks of ecstasy, but into a heightened sensitivity to the texture of life itself. The world has not changed. Your perception has. And yet, because this perception lacks the old narratives and expectations, it can feel alien and even hollow at first. Many people attempt to bypass this stage by seeking new identities, philosophies, or external authorities to define their experience. They read, they meditate, they follow teachers, hoping for a shortcut out of the uncertainty. Watts warned that this is precisely the trap. No external guide can create your freedom. The in-between state is an invitation to develop intimacy with your own awareness, to confront the raw presence of life without preconceptions. It is a time to be a witness to yourself, to observe your thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations without immediately labeling them as good or bad, right or wrong. It is also a time of paradoxical learning. You may feel that you are doing nothing, yet this apparent stillness is profoundly active. Watts likened this to the quiet before a tide. The ocean does not rush, yet immense forces are at work beneath the surface. In the same way, your consciousness is reorganizing, your perception is shifting, and the foundation of your identity is subtly realigning, even if you cannot see it yet. And so, the in-between state is not stagnation, even though it feels like it. It is a gestation, a moment of internal reshaping where old selves are released, and the new self has not yet fully emerged. The challenge and the gift is to inhabit this space fully, without resistance, without judgment, without the compulsion to escape. One of the most difficult aspects of the in-between state is the tension between observation and participation. You are deeply aware that your old patterns no longer satisfy, yet the world continues to demand engagement. Alan Watts often described this as the paradox of being fully awake while still part of the dream. You see the play for what it is, the illusions and the repetitive cycles, but your body and mind are still enmeshed in them. You act, speak, and interact, yet there is a subtle detachment, a quiet noticing of how hollow or constructed much of life has always been. This dual awareness can be disorienting. You are present, yet partially outside yourself, involved, yet uninvolved. In this phase, the ego often protests. It whispers that something has gone wrong, that you are failing life, failing yourself, failing others. Watts would remind you that these are echoes of old conditioning, the habitual insistence that identity must be maintained, that meaning must be grasped, that the self must be in control. But the in-between state is teaching a different truth, that clinging to a fixed identity is the source of suffering, and that the ego must loosen its grip to allow the deeper self to emerge. And yet, loosening is not easy. There is fear of irrelevance, fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappearing altogether. You may notice a kind of emotional flatness during this time. Joy no longer arrives in the old ways. Desire loses its intensity, and even the pursuit of purpose can feel strangely hollow. This is not depression in the clinical sense, nor is it failure. It is the nervous system recalibrating after the collapse of old frameworks. Watts explained that awakening often strips away the familiar scaffolding of the mind, leaving you momentarily suspended. You feel neither lost nor free, neither fulfilled nor empty, but somewhere in between, a liminal zone where transformation quietly occurs. Interestingly, this suspension can bring clarity. Without the distractions of identity, ambition, or attachment, you begin to notice subtle currents within yourself. Thoughts, sensations, and emotions that once went unnoticed now register with striking clarity. Watts often emphasized that the spiritual path is less about acquiring knowledge and more about refining awareness, learning to inhabit the raw immediacy of experience. In the in-between state, you are given a rare opportunity to watch yourself with honesty, without the need for judgment or action. Some people try to escape this period by seeking external frameworks, new philosophies, teachers, or practices. But Watts cautioned that true awakening cannot be outsourced. The in-between state is an intimate encounter with your own consciousness. It asks you to be patient, to observe, to inhabit the discomfort without trying to resolve it immediately. You are neither lost nor free. You are suspended, and in that suspension lies potential. As paradoxical as it may seem, it is precisely this liminal space that allows for profound insight. By no longer clinging to old forms of meaning, by stepping outside habitual responses and identifications, you create the conditions for the emergence of a more authentic, fluid self. The old maps have collapsed, but the terrain of possibility has opened wide. Watts would say that you are learning to exist without certainty, to experience life without pretense, to see the world freshly, unfiltered by past conditioning. One of the most profound lessons of this in-between state is the realization that identity is never fixed. It is always provisional, always unfolding. Alan Watts often said that the self is like a wave on the ocean. It appears separate, but it is inseparable from the whole. In this liminal phase, you feel the wave dissolving before it rises again, and this can be terrifying because it leaves you without familiar reference points. Your past roles, achievements, and labels no longer define you, and yet the new self has not fully crystallized. You are being asked to trust something invisible, something beyond the ego's grasp, and this trust is the very essence of freedom. During this time, you may notice a quiet loneliness, a sense of being between worlds. Friends and loved ones continue to live in their habitual patterns, pursuing goals, chasing pleasure, or reacting to fears. And you no longer feel compelled to participate in the same way. Watts would suggest that this is not separation in a negative sense, but the natural consequence of awakening. The old alignments no longer fit your evolving consciousness. You feel detached from familiar social rhythms, yet more connected to the subtle flow of life itself. The world has not changed. Your perception has. And with this shift, old comforts no longer provide satisfaction, while new possibilities remain invisible. This in-between state also magnifies the paradox of desire. You may want to feel clarity, peace, or fulfillment, yet the very act of wanting these experiences can obstruct them. Watts repeatedly emphasized that seeking is the mind's habit, the ego's attempt to assert control over existence. The in-between moment asks you to release the compulsion to grasp, to stop trying to manufacture meaning or happiness, and to simply be present with what is. Only in this release can subtle insight emerge. You are neither lost in craving nor free in possession. You are suspended, and this suspension is fertile ground. Many describe a strange sense of emptiness during this phase, but Watts would call it potential. Like a room cleared of furniture, it feels bare, cold, and unfinished. Yet emptiness is precisely what allows something new to take shape. The in-between state is teaching patience and observation, asking you to trust that life will reveal itself in its own time. You cannot rush it, force it, or fix it. The mind may resist this surrender, fearing loss of identity, relevance, or control. But the very resistance signals the depth of transformation underway. And so, living in this suspended state requires a delicate balance. Attention without grasping, participation without attachment, awareness without expectation. Watts often reminded his listeners that the goal is not to escape life or create a new identity on demand, but to allow consciousness to unfold naturally. The in-between state, as uncomfortable as it feels, is a crucible of understanding. By being fully present, by observing the dissolution of old patterns without judgment, you prepare the ground for the emergence of a self that is fluid, authentic, and aligned with the subtle rhythms of existence. As you move deeper into this in-between state, you may notice a subtle shift in your relationship with life itself. Ordinary events no longer hold the same gravity, and the pursuit of conventional goals feels increasingly hollow. Alan Watts often pointed out that the human mind mistakes doing for being, action for existence. In the in-between phase, you are learning to distinguish the two. You are still acting in the world, working, talking, participating, but the compulsion to define yourself through these actions is loosening. You begin to experience life as it is, rather than life as a mirror reflecting your ego's desires and fears. This period can also bring a heightened awareness of impermanence. Relationships, achievements, and identities that once seemed solid now appear fragile, temporary, and often illusory. Watts described this as the realization that all forms are transient, that clinging to them is the root of suffering. And yet, this recognition is not meant to make you nihilistic or detached in a cold sense. Rather, it invites a gentler, more expansive presence. You start to appreciate life, not for what it gives you, but for what it is in its raw, unadorned reality. There is a strange liberation in seeing that nothing needs to be held onto, and everything is already complete in the present moment. At times, you may experience moments of deep discomfort. Fear, doubt, and confusion can arise as your old frameworks collapse. You may question your purpose, your value, or even your right to exist in this new awareness. Watts would encourage you to approach these moments with curiosity rather than resistance. The discomfort itself is a teacher. It reveals where attachment, expectation, and identity have been clinging too tightly. It points to the spaces within you that are ready for expansion, for letting go, for transformation. One of the most profound aspects of this phase is the development of subtle joy, a quiet, unassuming contentment that does not depend on external events or achievements. Watts often emphasized that real joy is not a peak experience or a thrill. It is a constant underlying presence that is discovered when we stop grasping for the world to conform to our desires. In the in-between state, this joy is like a soft light beneath the surface of life. It may not always be visible, but it exists nonetheless, waiting for your awareness to rest upon it. Finally, the in-between state is an invitation to presence, to fully inhabit the moments as they arise, to observe without expectation, to allow life to unfold without interference. Watts repeatedly taught that the mind often obstructs life by trying to control, predict, or possess it. The suspended phase after awakening strips away these illusions, leaving you with a clear, unobstructed awareness. Though it may feel uncertain or empty at times, this state is a doorway to freedom, a space where the old self dissolves and the new self, unformed but authentic, begins to emerge. Eventually, the in-between state begins to reveal its gifts, though subtly. You may notice that the old anxieties, compulsions, and cravings have loosened their grip. Watts often said that freedom is not something you achieve by adding more to life, but by letting go of what no longer serves you. In this suspended phase, you are gradually learning to release old expectations and attachments. You are discovering that being neither lost nor free is not a failure. It is a necessary gestation. It is the space in which a new, more fluid self quietly emerges. During this period, the world may seem quieter, less urgent, less demanding. And yet, this quietude is not emptiness in the negative sense. It is richness waiting to be recognized. Alan Watts likened this to the stillness at the center of a hurricane. Motion surrounds you. Chaos continues. But at the core, there is a calm, a vast openness that has always been present. The challenge is to rest in this calm without fleeing to old habits, without seeking reassurance, and without trying to fix the in-between state. The very act of surrender is what allows transformation to occur. You may also notice a subtle reorientation of values. What once seemed important approval, recognition, achievement, control, begins to lose its power over you. Watts emphasized that awakening is not about becoming superior or enlightened in the way society defines it. It is about discovering the natural flow of life beneath the illusions of identity. You begin to see that your old life, with all its ambitions and attachments, no longer aligns with the consciousness that is emerging. You are neither rejecting life nor clinging to it. You are learning to experience it on a deeper, more authentic level. At times, there will be fear. The mind may whisper that you are adrift, that you have lost your way, that the old joys are gone forever. But Watts would remind you that this fear is a companion of growth, not a signal of failure. The in-between state requires patience, observation, and trust. It asks you to inhabit life fully, even when familiar supports have disappeared. In doing so, you discover that freedom is not a goal to be reached, but a quality of presence that arises naturally when clinging ceases. And so, the in-between state is both unsettling and sacred. It is the threshold between the old self and the new, a liminal space where clarity and disorientation coexist. Watts often described awakening not as an instant revelation, but as a gradual uncovering of reality, a learning to perceive life without the filters of expectation and identification. You are being invited to witness the dissolution of the old, to be present with the rawness of existence, and to allow the authentic self to emerge in its own time. In the end, being neither lost nor free is not a failure. It is a sign that transformation is underway. The old identity has collapsed, and the new has yet to fully form. Watts would say that this is the space where true awakening happens, quiet, patient, and profound. You are learning to inhabit life without the props of certainty, without the illusions of control, and in that spacious presence, something extraordinary quietly unfolds. The in-between state is not a void. It is the beginning of everything. It is your consciousness stepping into its own natural freedom, in its own time, in its own way.